Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at Prophets on the Right, Profiles of Conservative Critics of American Globalism by Ronald Radosh. This book was published in 1975, and it covers a few different thinkers and one politician, Senator Robert Taft, and it also discusses John Flynn, Oswald Garrison Villard, Lawrence Dennis, and Charles Beard. You may have heard of some of these people before, you may not have. They're of varying degrees of notoriety. Lawrence Dennis, probably the least well-known of these. And Charles Beard, probably the most well-known. Or Senator Taft. At any rate, I only want to focus on two individuals here. That would be Oswald Garrison Villard and John Flynn. The section on Senator Taft is very interesting, but I have a couple of other books about Senator Taft, and I'm probably going to go to those books to get some more detail. I'll, at some point in the future, be reviewing those two books so we can look a little closer at Senator Taft. He's sort of an icon of the old right. So I'm not going to discuss Taft here today. I want to focus on Villard and Flynn. In particular, I want to focus on their involvement with the America First Committee, as well as their involvement with some ostensibly liberal publications. Now, this author here, Ronald Radosh, seems to me that he is not exactly a conservative himself, but he gives them pretty fair treatment, I think, all things considered. Now, again, written in 1975, this is a time when the left is tending to be essentially anti-war, right? I mean, this is 7 years after Woodstock. The hippie generation is still going strong in the mid-70s. And have moved more and more into positions of authority in the Democratic Party. So you really have the anti-war, the anti-Vietnam, anti-draft left at this time. And so they're looking back and saying, well, we've actually got a few people that were essentially on the right who held some opinions that we can at least find some sort of common ground with. He doesn't agree with everything, I think, that these various figures did and said, but he gives them a fair shake and discusses their positions and their arguments. And so I think he does a pretty good job, despite the fact that I don't believe that this author is really a conservative. He doesn't really come across as a conservative. And the sections on the other figures here, Beard and Dennis, are also pretty interesting as well. But Beard and Dennis are not really involved in the America First Committee, and that was what I wanted to highlight here, so I'm not going to talk about those figures at this time. So like all my episodes, I'm going to read a couple of sections and provide a little bit of feedback. More stuff, I think, that I'm going to be looking more closely at Flynn than Villard. But I'm going to talk about both, and they're both very interesting. They both have somewhat similar career paths. Flynn, I think, was a more prolific author than Villard. But I'm going to talk about Villard first, and then later I'll go into detail about Flynn and more extensive detail about the America First Committee, because Flynn was more closely involved, I think, in the America First Committee than Villard was. So jumping in here where he talks about Oswald Garrison Villard, one thing I want to say before I start reading is that Villard is the grandson of a famous abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison, and he's essentially starts his career as a liberal, as a figure on the left. And actually the same thing applies to John Flynn. He was more of a liberal towards the beginning of his career and moved more toward conservatism as time went on. Now, Villard was the owner through his father. His father actually had purchased a couple of magazines. One of them was The Nation, and Villard was very involved in The Nation. He was the owner, and he was also an editor, or the editor, I should say, of The Nation. At one point, although he handed off control, as you'll see here, of The Nation, but he was still writing in The Nation magazine. He had been very involved in the magazine, The Nation. You're probably familiar with The Nation. It's still published today. It's a left-leaning magazine. So he says, quote, "The right of the people to declare war or peace was the most fundamental power any self-governing people would reserve to itself. For that reason, Villard supported the Ludlow Amendment for a nationwide referendum before war could be declared. Until such an amendment passed both houses of Congress, Villard wanted to take every possible precaution to prevent men in high places from making decisions that would lead to war. Villard also favored compulsory neutrality without allowing for modification. The new editors of The Nation, an editorial board to whom he had turned over active management of the magazine late in 1932, disagreed with their publisher's analysis. They favored giving the president authority to direct an arms embargo against aggressor nations. Restrictive laws would harm America by prohibiting active support to the threatened democracies. They favored sanctions, arms embargoes, and extension of the neutrality ban to all materials that could be used for purposes of war. They favored collective security through action with League of Nations powers against Mussolini. For America to meet its responsibilities, the Nation editors favored economic sanctions against aggressors. Villard had already retired as active editor of The Nation. Growing indication that the new editors were now actively opposed to his policies led Villard to sell the magazine to a liberal New York stockbroker in April of 1935. Under the agreement of sale, Villard was to continue to write his weekly column. International events only widened the gap between Villard and the magazine's editors. They were particularly incensed about Villard's endorsement of non-interference in the Spanish Civil War. The Nation favored sale of arms to the Spanish Republican government, a measure that even many left isolationists supported. Villard, however, refused to support a curb to the arms embargo in the Spanish case. He continued to insist upon strict neutrality, even though Germany and Italy were aiding General Franco, and even though Villard's own sympathies lie with the Spanish loyalists. The editors finally ran an editorial proclaiming that Villard's words were aiding the cause of the Nazi dictator. To this attack, Villard replied that Hull's decision to allow Roosevelt to decide between aggressor and aggrieved would only assure that the nation would end up fighting a war in which the people had no concern. Villard was preoccupied with the nation's experience before World War I, when the populace was deceived by lying propagandists, the entanglement of big businessmen with the English war machine, and the false Wilson slogans. He believed that the past was again being repeated, and that Cordell Hull and Franklin D. Roosevelt were playing the old Wilsonian game. At this point, Villard stopped his attacks on Hitler and Nazism, and he became obsessed with the necessity to keep America out of war. When others argued that 1937 was not 1914 and that America clearly needed discriminatory neutrality, Villard asked, "How do they know that we ought to be on the side of the democracies, that the cause of the democracies will be any juster than that of the Allies in 1914 to 1917? The Allies might turn out," he argued, "to be aggressors for their own evil ends." Like other defenders of neutrality, Villard continued to hope that Roosevelt's commitment to domestic reform would keep him away from fruitless foreign adventures. After the 1936 election, Villard continued to hope that the president would continue the further reorganization of economic and social life. He was aware that the conservative Supreme Court was blocking critical New Deal programs. To deal with that problem, Villard favored a constitutional amendment that would give Congress the power to pass new laws without judicial review. The president rejected that path. Instead, he proposed, in February of 1937, to produce a New Deal majority on the court by enlarging the number of justices and by forcing the resignation of some of the members. Villard responded negatively to Roosevelt's course. He detected in Roosevelt's attempt to pack the court a high-handed maneuver that was politically expedient but probably unconstitutional. The bill had been drafted in secret, he wrote, and the president sought to jam it through Congress by political pressure. Such a procedure, if regularly used, could end with the downfall of Congress and the birth of dictatorship. What Villard objected to as well was the possibility that strong executive power might be used at a later date to bring the nation closer to war. The president might be tempted to take steps that led to involvement. It was even worth delaying the passage of New Deal programs if one result was a weak presidential power in the area of foreign policy. Once again, the Nation editors were aghast that Villard joined anti-New Deal conservatives on the court issue. The charge that Roosevelt was showing fascist tendencies was a slander coming from the Liberty League, public utility barons, industrial spies, and big industrialists. What was Villard doing, they asked, when he echoed their spurious charges? Haywood Brown used his column in The Nation to attack Villard for echoing the arguments of FDR's conservative opponents. Villard retorted that Brown would have desired a rote opposition to the conservatives regardless of their case. Brown and AFL President William Greene were political enemies, yet they were both enemies of fascism. According to Brown's present logic, Villard argued, Brown should have editorially come out in favor of Hitler since Greene was his adversary. Villard found support from the ranks of the isolationists. Senator Burton K. Wheeler, an opponent of intervention, wrote Villard about a speaking tour of the Midwest in which he had called for an American retreat from Asia. We went to war to make the world safe for democracy, and we have had less democracy than we did before. As for lining up with England and France to stop fascism, a position supported by some radicals as well as conservatives, Wheeler feared that it might mean that America would end up with a fascist government. It might also mean a war in which the United States fought European nations over control of African colonies. Villard accepted such information as proof that most Americans agreed with firm neutrality and did not wish to risk the possibility of war. End quote. So basically you see here that Villard starts out as the owner and editor of The Nation magazine, and he hands over editorial control at one point to some other people, and then because the editorial board disagrees with him so vehemently, he ultimately sells the magazine. I find that kind of peculiar. He owns the magazine, and you would suppose that if the editors were being too obstinate in their opposition to him, being the owner of the magazine, he could simply replace the editorial board with one that agreed with him. I'm not sure why that wouldn't be the case. Now, it may be the case that he needed money, and ultimately, instead of firing the editors and replacing them with editors that agreed with him, he just sold the magazine. But the magazine was so deeply influential, it seems to me that if he truly believed in the things that he was arguing for, he would keep the magazine and simply replace the editors. But I don't know, maybe that's taboo in the publishing industry for the owner or the publisher of a magazine to exert too much editorial control. But it is the future of the nation we're talking about here, and maybe it would have been beneficial to simply exert your control over the magazine to get it to say what you want it to say. That doesn't seem too far-fetched. But at any rate, he disagrees with the editors of the magazine, and he begins to come out against some of FDR's positions. So his disagreements with FDR started off a little more slowly and tame. He generally seems to agree with the thrust of the New Deal, but he doesn't agree with Roosevelt's court-packing scheme. Roosevelt wants to jam through the New Deal proposals he has that the Supreme Court is blocking. He basically wants to force some of the Supreme Court members to retire, and he wants to increase the number of people on the Supreme Court, and he basically wants to the president wants to use his power to force the Supreme Court to reflect his positions. This was pretty unpopular and had a lot of conservative opposition, and ultimately that never happened. But Villard here is disagreeing with FDR's court-packing scheme, And of course, this puts him in the same camp as the conservatives who opposed it. So then, you get the people, I believe it was a columnist, Brown, who attacks Villard for echoing the arguments of FDR's conservative opponents. Villard basically says, well, you're just opposing the conservatives just because. And whatever the conservatives say, you're going to say the opposite, regardless of the content of the argument, just because you're a hyper-partisan who just disagrees with the conservatives on the basic principle that conservatives are always bad and always wrong. He says if the conservatives oppose fascism, then you have to support fascism to be intellectually consistent here. Otherwise, you're also echoing the arguments of the conservatives. It's really nonsense if you don't actually think about the issues on an issue-by-issue, point-by-point basis and make an argument that has some sort of foundation in a logical position that other than just blanket opposition of whatever the conservatives say. So more and more Villard begins seeing this sort of idiotic hypocrisy coming from the liberals, and more he begins to oppose them, despite the fact that he really was a liberal. He was involved in a lot of liberal institutions and positions, and he was I think the head of the NAACP. His father, I think, helped found the NAACP. He was involved in a lot of essentially liberal organizations and causes. But more and more he sees the liberals just lining up behind FDR. Whatever FDR wants to do is good all the time. Just sort of mindless support for whatever FDR wants to do. And Villard can't accept that. He says you've got to be a little bit more discerning than that. So moving on from here, he says, quote, Villard's outspoken criticisms of the Roosevelt administration proved to be too much for the nation's new editor and publisher, Frida Kirchway, who had purchased the magazine in 1937. At one time, she had taken a poll of readers and had found that most disagreed intensely with Villard's position. Now, his column was receiving even more vehement protests. She proclaimed that to attack Roosevelt, even by means of a series of questions, at a time when he is fighting tooth and nail against a reactionary coalition in Congress, seems to me a serious error in judgment and also was unfair. Villard did not see the necessity of compromising principle for the sake of being part of a broad liberal coalition. He saw himself as trying to gather support for far-reaching change. The pseudo-reforms, the waste, the extravagance, inefficiency, and militarism of Roosevelt, he wrote editor Kirchway, were the forces destroying what both he and the new editor sought to accomplish. FDR, he thought, was just another Ramsay MacDonald who was opening the way to either fascism or collapse of the forces of reform, precisely like the socialists in Germany. Villard believed that the New Deal was failing, not because of the obstructionism of congressional conservatives, but because of the failures of Roosevelt. As for the charges that he had changed his cherished liberal viewpoint, Villard argued that he was only trying to maintain principle. I have lived through so many disasters to liberalism like the one I see coming now, he explained, that I cannot sit silent and overlook wrongdoing in Washington without protest. It was Kirchway, not he, who was playing right into the hands of the fascists by not standing out against the president on his abominable militarization of the country. 1 million people were already mobilized in a new war machine, making up the most powerful lobby in Washington, which could offset everything that the New Deal should stand for. It was Roosevelt's own policies, as far as Villard was concerned, that had created a conservative politics. Villard, moreover, argued that Roosevelt's desire to meet force with force complemented Hitler's own philosophy. The United States had assumed responsibility for defending Central and South America, and the nation's doctrine was now that of a country in arms. America had become committed to Hitler's doctrine of reliance upon the use of force. FDR claimed that force would be used only in defense, but that was exactly the argument made by Hitler. Both the language and policies of powers that used force were similar. FDR's militarization made the United States indistinguishable from Nazi Germany. Americans did not stop to inquire whether the means they were adopting would destroy the very democracy they sought to preserve. Villard opposed Roosevelt's interventionist measures, but that did not imply approval of what was going on in Germany and Italy. In August 1940, after France and Britain had declared war, he visited both England and Germany. He was disgusted with what he found in Berlin and publicly reaffirmed his hope that England would win. The belligerents were not moral equals, but he did not relate this opinion to the issue of American entrance into the war. Even if Hitler won, he believed, there would be no threat to American security. Roosevelt, like Woodrow Wilson, was deliberately conspiring to whip up hysteria, along with other conspiratorial elements, in an effort to put America into the war, and thus to divert attention from the domestic failures of his administration. By May of 1940, the conflict had reached a point of no return. Kirchway informed Villard that his contract with the nation would not be renewed. She would keep him on only on a weekly basis and would cut his fee from $50 to $30 per column. The magazine had come out in favor of aid to Britain on an extended level, along with universal military training. This meant, Villard wrote, that Kirchway had joined hands with all the forces of reaction against which the nation had battled so strongly in the past. Roosevelt's policies, he protested, would destroy the New Deal, subjugate labor, and enthrone reaction, precisely as did our last adventure into war, which finished the new freedom. War and liberty, Villard insisted, do not mix. Kirchway and the nation would have to bear a heavy share of responsibility for new reactionary measures. You will be wailing because of the new crop of Mitchell Palmers and J. Edgar Hoovers who will be doing to death the causes for which you have stood. Villard promised to touch lightly on these themes in his last column and to part amicably, for the sake of the magazine, but privately he let Kirchway know that he thought she had prostituted his once liberal journal. Judging from the way Kirchway was treating him, Villard undoubtedly thought that she was accusing him of pursuing a pro-Axis policy. From the aim of building an anti-fascist popular front, a goal that Kirchway sought along with liberal administration supporters and communists, any criticism of Roosevelt and the New Deal was fuel for the Nazi engine. America is to be safeguarded not by guns and by warships, but only by greater economic and industrial wisdom, by social virtue, by making our democracy work, and not by creating a state rivaling Hitler's and substituting guns for butter. His association with the nation had begun in January of 1894 and had come to an end 46.5 years later. End quote. So here you see he's basically now at this point kicked out of the nation. The new editor who purchased the magazine in 1937, Frida Kirchway, keeps pushing him out and arguing with him, and more his pay goes down, and they're just like, all right, you're done. No more of this. No more of your opinions in the nation. What you're arguing for is unpopular. Apparently she had done a poll of the readers, and the readers didn't agree with Villard's position. So she told him, all right, look, you're done. We're not going to go along with you any longer. He was the former owner. He was the former editor. And the whole thing seems really disrespectful to him. In my opinion, I think they probably should have treated him a little bit better than that and left the door open for at least some sort of dissenting opinion. But in this time, in the lead up to World War II, and there just was not a lot of room for dissent. It wasn't quite as bad, I don't think, as Wilson was. Wilson, in World War I, also a Democrat, was really cracked down on dissent in a major way. I don't think the atmosphere was quite so bad in World War II as it was in World War I, but it remained that nobody was really allowed to disagree with the president. And so this guy who had been so involved with the nation was unceremoniously booted. One thing that I think is interesting here is the way that, now granted these guys are, they're both liberals, they're all liberals, they all consider themselves liberals, but the constant argument is, no, you're the fascist, no, you're the fascist, you're the reactionary, no, you're the reactionary. You get that a lot. It always seems to me kind of pathetic in a way. It's just, painting one another with the sort of boogeyman, and we still get that today. You're the real racists. No, you're the real racists. And so on and so forth. Or you're the real fascists. We still get that today, of course. The boogeyman is always fascism. Everywhere and at all times. There are a lot of other bad things in the world. let's not forget. So that's that. He disagrees with Roosevelt, and he starts getting more concerned with the potential of war in World War II and the potential of fascism in America under Roosevelt. So let's move on to the next section. Still talking, of course, about Villard. He says, quote, condemned as an advocate of appeasement and tainted with the brush of pro-Nazism by his former colleagues, Villard, not surprisingly, was welcomed by some old-style conservatives. But some responsibility lay with the staff of the Nation, who decided they could no longer print his anti-war and old liberal views. Seeking an outlet, Villard joined the anti-interventionist America First Committee. Interventionists fought the committee as best they could. In June 1940, the playwright and presidential speechwriter Robert Sherwood took a newspaper ad asking whether the Nazis would considerately wait until we are ready to fight them. Any American saying that they would, Sherwood wrote, is either an imbecile or a traitor. Villard exploded when he saw the ad. He answered by addressing William Allen White, the journalist who had formed the Committee to Aid America by defending the Allies. There were millions of Americans, Villard retorted, who are not fifth columnists, nor imbeciles, or traitors, who do not agree that we are going to be alone in a barbarous world and that we are in jeopardy. Acknowledging that he and others might be wrong, Villard stressed that critics had a right to be treated just as loyal, just as sincere, and just as earnest Americans as Sherwood or anyone else. Villard disagreed with the America First Committee's support for building an impregnable defense for America. He had joined only on the ground that he had the right to differ with the committee as to what constitutes an impregnable defense. Nevertheless, Frieda Kirchway used that plank of the committee's program to embarrass Villard, pointing out to him that many of the other persons on the board are extreme reactionaries. Villard rejected the use of guilt by association. He admitted that he had joined a group whose members did not see eye to eye with him on all policies. But his major objective was to keep the United States out of war. He was willing to be associated with any non-communist group that is working sincerely for the same end. As for the reactionaries, they seemed to favor that goal, while the liberals were working to put us in. If the conservatives were going to stand for the principled liberal position, Villard would be glad to work with them. There was some substance to the charge that the America First Committee was made up of reactionaries and was dominated by businessmen. But the America First Committee was an umbrella anti-war organization, composed of both right and left isolationists. Both groups wanted to avoid war and to reject international entanglements. The left wing sought to insulate America against the historical forces they associated with monopoly capitalism and its internal contradictions. By doing so, they expected to assure this country of the independent opportunity to work out a just and democratic socialist solution. Unlike the isolationist Norman Thomas, such conservative isolationists as Herbert Hoover hoped to restore the economy to its pre-Depression vigor, and thus to save democracy by saving capitalism. Villard acknowledged that many businessmen in America First held a position similar to his own, but he no longer argued, as he did before World War I, that bankers and businessmen were taking the nation into war. Yet one cannot say, he emphasized to Porter Sargent, that the businessmen are putting us into war. The responsibility for that lay with Franklin D. Roosevelt. Villard thought that the president would put us into the war before Election Day if he thinks that Wilkie is licking him, and then we shall have the cry raised, a vote for Wilkie is a vote for Hitler. Villard feared that 5 years hence Americans would be living under a totalitarian machine, since once war arrived, civil liberties were invariably curbed. William Graham Sumner had shown a previous generation that after the Spanish-American War, Americans ended up practicing the very evils they had sought to punish Spain for. We were torturing, concentrating, burning villages and crops, doing every single thing for which we had denounced the Spaniards. So it will be when we go to war with Hitler. Villard regretted that to point this truth out meant that one was subjected to being called a fifth columnist, a pro-Nazi, a traitor. Having lost his audience, Villard began to talk with others about the possibility of starting up the old nation. Interest was expressed by John Chamberlain, George Layton, Norman Thomas, John T. Flynn, and others. The difficulty was lack of money, because many of the liberals and Jews who supported the nation are now for war, particularly the Jews. Villard thought of trying to gather backing from the middle class in the Midwest, which opposed intervention. He wanted to avoid appealing to the sophisticated intellectual group to which the nation and the new republic now appeal. This group, which unfortunately comprised exactly the reading public for magazines like The Nation, he now defined as a small minority who would put their own country into war in opposition to the wishes of their fellow citizens. Pearl Harbor ended his career as an opponent of war. Now he was to concentrate on trying to help his countrymen avoid the evils he thought were imminent. Villard wanted the citizenry to gain control over the direction of foreign policy. Those who had control branded their critics as reactionary. End quote. So, of course, now Villard is subject to the ongoing claim that because he's opposing war, because he's opposing FDR, even once the war begins, he continues to get called a reactionary. Anyone who opposes the people who are in control gets branded as a reactionary. The big, scary accusation. So, at any rate, here we see that he's joined the America First Committee. Now that he's lost his old audience and he's looking for a new outlet, he joins the America First Committee. And what I think is interesting is, they try to smear him because he's joined this organization. They try to smear him with a guilt by association, condemned as a fifth columnist or an imbecile. Apparently, this person, Robert Sherwood, a playwright and presidential speechwriter, took out a newspaper ad and calls everyone who disagrees with him an imbecile or a traitor. Villard responds, essentially saying that he acknowledges that he and others might be wrong. His point is that the people that he's opposed to will never admit they're wrong. They will tar and smear everyone who disagrees with them. And Villard says, well, you know what? Critics of the president have a right to speak, have a right to share their opinion without being called traitors, without being called fifth columnists, without being called imbeciles. So he seems to be more in favor of a general atmosphere of free speech and the right to criticize, the right to dissent from the president, the right to disagree with the government. And he joins the America First Committee, and he says one of the terms of his joining was that he be allowed to disagree with the steering committee of the America First Committee, the people who are leading this organization. He has the right to disagree with them about the particular details of what their policies are. So interestingly here, you see an America First Committee that is comprised of both leftist isolationists and rightist isolationists, a sort of big tent umbrella organization that is generally anti-war, allows for dissent, allows for different factions within it to all participate. And it's really the Nation magazine and the liberal intelligentsia at large that is cracking down on any dissent. No one's allowed to disagree with us, or you're a traitor, you're a fifth columnist. No one is allowed to have a different opinion, just the same way he got kicked out of the magazine for having a differing opinion. I think Villard finds that the America First Committee and the people that are involved with it are much more tolerant in the end of differing ideas. And they give him, the opportunity to not agree with everything that they say and still be a participant. And I'm certain that you will recognize in this some echoes of the modern world where the left just refuses to allow anyone to disagree with them, and the extent to which you disagree with their principles, you are also, even now, nearly 100 years later, a Nazi, a reactionary, whatever they want to smear you with, all of these terms. If you disagree with them about anything, and it's not just disagreeing with their principles today, but if you're not following whatever changes they make, as the same thing Villard found when he tried to stick to his principles, but the position of the magazine continued to change and shift and become more and more pro-war and more pro-intervention, he didn't follow along. He didn't march to the changing tune of the drum, constantly saying, "Oh yeah, whatever the liberal consensus is, that's what I believe." because he didn't just shift along with prevailing opinion, that made him a reactionary, and that made him, this terrible. So it's really odd that the position constantly changes from the liberals as the thought leaders continue to push things. In some cases in the modern era, further and further leftward, and in this era it was more like pushing things further and further toward total deference to whatever the president wants, because they have a president who is ostensibly on their side. Whatever the president wants to do, you have to agree with it. And nowadays we see a sort of similar thing, whereas the right, the conservatives, are much more open to saying, yeah, you don't have to agree with us on everything. Let's just work together in the areas where we do agree. And it's a much more of an open ideologically to a variety of ideas in the marketplace of ideas, and whatever comes out victorious will come out victorious, and we'll just sort of let that happen. Whereas the left is just much more interested in total control of what people say and are allowed to say, and things of that nature. So that's all I'm going to talk about Villard. We can see the way he was kicked out of his magazine, joined the America First Committee, and was welcomed into that. So now I'm going to jump over to talk about John Flynn. And John Flynn's story follows a somewhat similar track, actually, as Villard's. Here he says, quote, "During the last half of 1940, liberal opinion began to shift toward intervention. In April, the liberal Kansas Republican newspaper editor William Allen White, along with Clark Eichelberger, set up a national group to get Congress to give aid to Britain and to strengthen U.S. defenses. Named the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies, the group quickly became a major force for intervention. By the end of the year," James J. Martin had commented, "Flynn was almost a solitary voice, defending what had now become a minority viewpoint. The passage of 5 years had seen no change of heart so spectacular as the about-face performed by American liberals in general on the subject of arms manufacture and the growth of military institutions. That shift in position even began to affect the New Republic. The editors of the magazine had previously supported neutrality legislation and had rejected collective security, but the Nazi victories in Europe caused many of their principal supporters to move toward favoring aid to the Allies. In June, contributing editors Lewis Mumford and Waldo Frank offered letters of resignation. They complained that the moral neutrality of the New Republic was similar to the lack of leadership of those European statesmen who allowed fascism to triumph in Europe. Given this kind of pressure, many readers of the New Republic were deeply offended by the tone of Flynn's remarks. In late 1940, Flynn offended his audience by suggesting that FDR was developing tendencies that approximated those of Hitler. In a review of a book by Gustav Stolper, who argued that Germany moved to fascism via social reform, Flynn wrote that when we get through with this last phase of the New Deal, we shall have added the elements of militarism, the shifts of power to the executive and militant chauvinism, basing our economy on a war industry promoted by an aggressive foreign policy. Flynn's column became so controversial that the editors prefaced it with the remark that they were publishing it for its own intrinsic worth, not because they agreed with it. They proceeded to reply to his column with their own comments, printed under the nasty heading, "Flynn again." Flynn did not comprehend the growing accusations made against him. "One of the things I cannot understand is that a liberal writer who is saying now the same things he said 5 years ago and 10 years ago, who is opposed to third terms for presidents, to warmongering and militarism and conscription and corrupt political machines and vast public debt, to shipping subsidies, to scrapping the antitrust laws and the fostering of monopolies, to hidden taxes, should be accused of holding these views because of a personal feeling against the president. I held these views before Roosevelt was president, and I have now lost my liberal credentials because I do not agree with the New York Times, the Herald Tribune, Mr. Harry Stimson, Mr. Franklin Roosevelt, and Wendell Willkie about the war." It was clear that the New Republic's editors could no longer tolerate Flynn. Editor Bruce Blyven wrote Flynn, "You have lost a good deal of your interest in the subject of your column, which was supposed to be Wall Street's economic policy. Blyven promised to continue to print Flynn's comments on finance and investments, but to run his other remarks only in the correspondence section of the magazine. "It is you who have changed," Blyven added, "and not the paper." Blyven ran the caption, "Mr. Flynn on War Hysteria," over Flynn's November 11th column rather than the usual title, Other People's Money. A note also appeared that Flynn's regular column, which had appeared continually since May 1933, would be discontinued with that issue. Lacking sufficient material for a weekly column on the original subject, Blyven explained to his readers, Mr. Flynn has ranged far afield and has frequently collided head-on with the views of the editors, to the annoyance of some readers, the pleasure of others, and the bewilderment of many. The editors announced that they had asked Flynn to write articles on his original theme, and they hoped these would appear often. Flynn was angry and defensive when he received Blyven's note. He denied that he had changed his philosophy. It was the war and the appalling betrayal of the American people by the president and the hysterical state of mind he has produced, which had caused many divisions amongst old friends. The new republic, Flynn charged, had failed to come to grips with the real problems of the economic system. Abandoning the position it had taken for many years, its editors had swallowed hook, line, and sinker the program of the War Party. It was of the utmost importance, Flynn wrote, that the foremost weekly journal of opinion in the United States, which for years thundered against the collective securities, the foreign policy of the Stimsons and Hulls, the war makers and militarists, should almost overnight not only abandon that tune and plunge headlong into the forefront of the War Party, but should suppress a columnist who remained at least one voice for its old opinions, and announce to the world that no writer should appear in its columns who was in complete collision with its views. Flynn's dismissal, the Reverend John Haynes Holmes wrote, was grievous news, with Villard flung from the nation, and now you from the paper with which you have so long and honorably been associated, to say nothing of Harry Elmer Barnes tossed off the Scripps Howard papers. To what a low, degraded estate has liberal journalism in this country fallen. End quote. So here we see John Flynn, who was a columnist for the New Republic, in a very similar situation where he's writing and he believes he's taking the same basic positions that he has always taken, and it's the paper that has totally shifted its opinion. And he's, of course, not the only one who says this. This is a charge that is echoed by James J. Martin. I'm not sure who James J. Martin is, but he points out that the passage of 5 years had seen no change of heart so spectacular as the about-face performed by American liberals. So the liberals, over the course of 5 years, had totally changed their position from anti-war to pro-war. You might hear some echoes of that in the modern situation with the Democratic Party here in 2024, and its enthusiasm for involving ourselves, although not in such a dramatic manner as was the case in the lead-up to World War II, but nevertheless, the Democrats and the liberals today seem very comfortable with advancing war or participating in war, or the Democrats today just don't really have that anti-war vibe anymore. They've lost that, and that's all with the Republicans now today. Now, you might say that there's been a shift in the Republicans as well. Granted, the parties shift and change from time to time. But, again, you see the same sort of, anybody who hasn't changed along with us, who hasn't done the appropriate about-face that is now demanded, is driven out of all of their publications. And they will allow for no dissenting opinions. And so there you have it. Flynn is booted out of the New Republic. Ultimately, he is dismissed from the magazine because he clashes with the editors too much. But Flynn insists he hasn't changed. It's the newspaper. It's the magazine, the New Republic, that has changed. So anyway, let's keep reading here. He says, quote, "The New Republic editors may have had another reason for dropping Flynn's column. In August of 1940, he joined with Philip La Follette, former governor of Wisconsin, and General Robert E. Wood of Sears, Roebuck and Company, to build a new, non-interventionist national group, the America First Committee. Flynn was a member of its National Executive Committee and chairman of the New York City chapter, and his participation in a group that included prominent right-wingers was an embarrassment for the pro-war liberal intellectuals. Flynn had lost all respect for the liberal interventionist establishment. On the other hand, such writers as William Rose Bennett were intimating that Adolf Hitler had created the isolationist movement in America. Men such as Bennett, Lewis Mumford, and Herbert Agar, Flynn wrote a few years later, had completely lost their reason. 2/3 of the men who operate under the mask of liberalism are not liberals at all, but are merely bigoted advocates of some system of their own or intolerant enemies of some other system. Flynn was right in saying that many liberal internationalists shared the imperial vision of the empire builders. Some liberals, such as Nation editor Frieda Kirchway, found the unabashedly imperialist sentiments of Henry Luce repulsive and denounced his pleas to establish the United States as the dominant power in the world, but other liberals responded favorably to Luce's famous American Century editorials, which appeared in March and April of 1941. The noted liberal intellectual Max Lerner, who was at that time close to the Marxist left, delivered a long reply, The People's Century. Lerner saw much to praise in Luce's views. Luce's thesis that the United States and Britain should combine to establish hegemony in the world, control the world's sea lanes and world trade, send out technicians to develop the world, and education to teach it, and food cargoes to feed it, and ideals to inspire it, had already been proposed, he noted, in New Republic editorials back in December 1940. True, Henry Luce held individualistic social ideals based upon commitment to private ownership, which Lerner found repugnant, but he stressed that liberals could not merely dismiss Luce as an imperialist, and urged that they search for what they had in common. The Time editor, Lerner wrote, spoke for a new capitalist-conscious group, most of them younger men, who do not fear the war, but regard it as an opportunity. Lerner made it clear that he was more in sympathy with Luce than with the anti-war liberals. I prefer him infinitely, though our purposes are as far removed as the four corners of the winds, to men like Burton Wheeler and John Flynn. End quote. So here you have a couple things. First of all, one of the reasons he says that the New Republic editors may have wanted to get rid of John Flynn was that Flynn had been involved apparently with the creation of the America First Committee. It says that in August 1940 he joined with Philip La Follette, who was a former governor of Wisconsin, and General Robert E. Wood of Sears, Roebuck and Company to build a new non-interventionist national group, the America First Committee. So apparently the three of them, Flynn, La Follette, and Robert Wood, were the founders of the America First Committee. And Flynn was the chairman of the New York City chapter. So he's pretty significantly involved in this organization, and this organization includes prominent right-wingers. So this is an embarrassment to the pro-war liberal intellectuals. And you get other nonsense, like people saying that, well, Adolf Hitler was responsible for the creation of the American isolationist movement, and other sorts of nonsense like that. And more people, so there's this fellow Henry Luce, who was apparently the editor of Time magazine. And you've got socialists, Marxists really, like Max Lerner, who are saying, well, they really prefer this capitalist Henry Luce because, he's an imperialist. He wants Britain and the United States to establish global hegemony, control. So Luce's thesis that the United States and Britain should combine to establish hegemony in the world, control the world's sea lanes, world trade, send out technicians to develop the world, education to teach it, food cargoes to feed it, ideals to inspire it. This is an American hegemonic globalist who wants basically America to control the world. And this had already been proposed in the New Republic. So this liberal magazine, the New Republic, had already been advocating for global American hegemony. The great liberal magazine. And so the Marxists say, well, we really agree with Luce and his hegemonic desires more so than we agree with the isolationists like Senator Burton Wheeler and John Flynn. That's who the Marxists and the liberals really would prefer to agree with, because ultimately they are globalists at their core, and they don't believe in the nation state. Max Lerner doesn't believe in the nation state. Henry Luce doesn't believe in the nation state. They might not approach it from exactly the same direction, but they're much more interested in the way that they share their globalism and in opposition to isolationism and nationalism that comes from Burton Wheeler and John Flynn, regardless of their social beliefs, regardless of whether John Flynn is, a liberal, considers himself a liberal. That's much less important than the dedication to globalism, and that's really what everything else must conform to. Of course, we see that today as well. The one thing that you cannot be on the left is a nationalist. So, as we continue on with this section on John Flynn, the author says, quote, "In January 1941, a month in which Flynn set out to campaign actively on behalf of the non-interventionist goals of the America First Committee, Flynn announced that America stands on the brink of war. Yet the World War was not about democracy. It was a war between empires and about imperialism. Flynn did not think that the character of the war had changed merely because England had been bombed. Describing Britain as the biggest of all these imperialist grabbers, Flynn argued that she had declared war on Germany not because she loved Poland, but because Britain has an empire of her own, which she seized exactly as Germany seized Poland. And she sees the rise of a German empire threatening the safety of her English empire. German hegemony would threaten British control of the Mediterranean, which she had to maintain to hold India and millions of people in Asia and Africa in subjection. Britain wanted to save her empire at the expense of her democracy, while Americans were being asked to risk their democracy on behalf of Britain's empire. The war was another chapter in the long, age-old struggle of European empires about dividing up the world. Flynn was opposed to empires, Roman, German, French, British, or American. The peace would resemble that of Versailles. The imperialist powers would make new deals. And it is out of this abominable world of imperialism, the scramble for dominion, the fight for trade backed by armies and guns, that I want to keep this great, peaceful, democratic America of ours. It was a small minority, a rich group centered on the eastern seaboard, that stood behind the interventionist drive. They agreed with Britain's desire to conquer the world. Although some were motivated by a humanitarian impulse to destroy Hitler, they all had been misled into working toward the destruction of the very institutions they had sought to defend within America. Those who sought to drive Hitler out of Europe did nothing to destroy the conditions that had created his original victory. The proof was their inability to do anything about preventing the collapse of the economy, which was kept alive only by the immense war industries which the government is paying for with more borrowed billions. War, even victorious war, Flynn argued, will destroy us. The president had promised in October 1940 that no United States boys would be sent off to war. Yet administration spokesmen were saying that they opposed a law that would limit the service of American troops to the Western Hemisphere. Charging that the administration was part of a gigantic conspiracy, Flynn argued that officials sworn to serve the nation were busy fabricating new provocations, generating newer and hotter hysteria, while leading internationalists threw off their disguises and demanded war, open, undisguised war. Flynn's speeches, given under the aegis of the America First Committee, infuriated his opponents. It could not be denied, philosopher and educator John Dewey wrote Flynn, that the committee was a Nazi transmission belt. This charge, Flynn retorted, came from the immature minds that make up the Park Avenue contingent of the war group in this country. As for Dewey's logic, it meant that we must quit trying to keep this country out of war in order to displease Hitler. Like many socialists, Flynn argued that it was under the influence of crumbling imperialism and the enervated and dying capitalist regimes of Europe I see fascism spreading. Predicting that entrance into the war would end with domestic fascism, Flynn told Dewey that because we want to save America from fascism, we are foolishly accused of being part of a Nazi front. Flynn pointed out to Dewey the militaristic attitudes and the praise of war itself that had started to appear in the columns of liberal writers, as well as an increasing advocacy of an American corporate state and dictatorial powers for the executive branch of government. Then ask yourself, he suggested to Dewey, how far do we have to travel to find ourselves in a nice, smiling, happy brand of American fascism, all decked out in the terminology of democracy? Dewey had joined up with a witch hunt on Americans who were struggling to keep this country out of war. But when and if war came, the values Dewey cherished would be destroyed. Flynn would save Dewey's letter as one of my melancholy souvenirs of this wretched era. Dewey's answer revealed that Flynn had partially reached him. It was others, he answered, who used the America First Committee as a Nazi transmission belt. He too opposed getting into the war, but was confused when I find it said that we must keep out of war, but armed to the teeth. If the U.S. must arm, Dewey argued, why not arm those nations defending themselves against the Nazis? Dewey also pointed to the differences between the two sides. He did not doubt that Germany is the greatest menace to civilization and humanity that has occurred since Genghis Khan. He also did not like the name America First Committee because it's too much like the nationalism that is a great cause of war. End quote. So interestingly, you see John Dewey enters the conversation here towards the end of this section. And I think there's a lot to criticize here in what John Dewey has said. I keep finding myself in various books just deeply opposed to John Dewey's whole state of mind, despite the fact that I think he's got a couple of good nuggets in some of his philosophy. It just seems a little bit ridiculous sometimes. He says he too is opposed to the war, but he doesn't understand why we should then say, well, we should arm ourselves. We should have a strong national defense. Dewey says, if we're going to spend all this money on our strong national defense, why don't we arm the people who are fighting the Nazis? In other words, if we're going to build up our own national defense, why wouldn't we also build up other nations' national defense? That seems like a weak logical argument right there. We're not under obligation to build up other nations' defenses in the way that we are under obligation to build up our own. We're not obligated to defend other people in the same way that we're obligated to defend ourselves, obviously. He says it's a Nazi transmission belt. It's ridiculous. Well, the America First Committee is just advancing Nazi ideas. John Dewey doesn't seem to have I don't think, a really good political intuition here. He says, oh no, it's not you, it's other people that are using the America First Committee as a Nazi transmission belt. And he also says that he doesn't like the name America First Committee because it's too much like the nationalism that is a great cause of war. So how shallow does this start to seem once you dig in a little bit, once you scrape under the surface of John Dewey's aghast opposition to the America First Committee? You see that, well, he really doesn't like the name. And he doesn't like the idea that they want to build up a strong national defense without also building up other countries' national defenses. And he doesn't like the name. And he thinks that Germany is the greatest threat to civilization since Genghis Khan. It seems like John Dewey has just swallowed the propaganda. He may be a decent philosopher of pragmatic epistemology, but his political intuitions don't seem all that great to me. Particularly when we think back of the John Dewey book that I reviewed way back when, Reconstruction and Philosophy, where he talked about war and atomic war, and he'd written this after the end of World War II, but he had said that, well, granted that we dropped the bomb on Japan and we had unleashed this mass death, and technology has at least some culpability in the very existence of atomic bombs dropped on cities of civilians. And back in that book, John Dewey had said, well, it's not really technology's fault. It's not science's fault. It's the fault of the existence of war. The existence of war itself. And I had said back then, war is something that will always be with us. You can't blame war itself unless you are proposing to eliminate war entirely, which is not really possible. But then when some organization attempts to say, let's not make this war any worse than it already is by bringing all of our own resources to bear into it, creating even more death and destruction, let's stand back and stay out of this war, which would probably have prevented the dropping of those bombs if we had stayed out of the war. And I won't get into the Pearl Harbor and what and why that happened. There's more to that than meets the eye. But by the time Pearl Harbor happened, it was pretty obvious that we were leaning really heavily toward helping the Allies. We were providing them with all sorts of support, leading right up to, but not quite entering into the war. But it just seems a little ridiculous to try to attribute so much responsibility to the name America First Committee, because it's too similar to, it's too evocative of nationalism, and nationalism is really the cause of war. So what, America First Committee is responsible for war? That doesn't make any sense at all. The America First Committee is somehow participating in the furtherance of war on Earth because it evokes nationalism. It's the most anti-war organization that was existing in America at the time. So it seems like politically, John Dewey just buys into really shallow left-wing propaganda. Disappointing, I think. But Flynn is really saying that this is a war between empires. Britain sees its empire threatened by the rise of Germany, and that's why they want to get into this war. Now, how true that is, I don't know. I'm not a student of World War II. But I certainly think that England, the Great Britain, had just as much culpability in its participation in the war. Jumped into the war to defend Poland when Hitler invaded Poland. England jumped right in to defend Poland, and then the Soviet Union scooped up half of Poland from the other side, and you have to wonder, how much does this really make sense, and what options did the UK have to just not do that, to just leave it alone and say, well, the Nazis invaded Poland. That sucks, but it doesn't have anything to do with us. Probably a lot of lives could have been saved if they had just said, all right, sayonara, let Poland go. Unfortunate, and perhaps it would have turned around at some point, but I don't think that I don't think there's an awful lot of good that came out of World War II. So at any rate, let me jump back in here and keep moving. He says, quote, the charge that America First was a Nazi transmission belt had first been voiced by an interventionist group, the Reverend Leon M. Burkhead's Friends of Democracy. They had accused the committee of serving to spread the anti-democratic ideas of Nazism into millions of American homes. The charge was a smear, but Flynn and the committee were not helped by the fact that Nazi and anti-Semitic elements were offering America First their support. The Christian Front, the German-American Bund, and Joseph McWilliams' anti-Semitic American Destiny Party all moved to endorse Flynn's New York chapter of the America First Committee. Flynn always did his best to keep these elements out. He was not always successful. On February 20th, 1941, Flynn's chapter sponsored a rally with socialist leader Norman Thomas and Senators Nye and Wheeler, who were to urge the defeat of Lend-Lease. Much to Flynn's chagrin, most of the 3,500 people in the audience were pro-fascist and anti-Semitic. Most prominent was Joseph McWilliams, the self-styled American Nazi. Cries of "The Jews! The Jews!" came from the audience. Although Flynn told the crowd that America First did not approve doctrines which stimulate racial hatreds or religious hatred, it had little effect. America First's opponents were pleased. Flynn's group was castigated by his own former publishing outlet, the New Republic. "Willingly or not," their editorial proclaimed, "our most respected appeasers are being drawn into a closely united front with the most vicious elements of American fascism." When 22,000 people packed into Madison Square Garden for a major America First rally in mid-May, Flynn learned that McWilliams was in the audience. He immediately informed the crowd that America First was in no way responsible for McWilliams' presence. "What he is doing here, how he got in, or whose stooge he is, I do not know, but I do know that the photographers for the war-making newspapers always know where to find him." The problem of America First's effectiveness being diminished because of the unsolicited support given the committee by anti-Semitic elements was most serious. Flynn wrote General Robert Wood that he felt the committee was composed of too diverse a group of people. He feared that some of the reactionary elements that had latched onto the committee would try to control it in order to advance their own objectives. He was concerned, he told Wood, about the powerful anti-Semitic undercurrent moving around the country. He had observed it himself in New York, among some men who were both wealthy and powerful. Flynn believed that the Jews had given people plenty of good cause to be indignant at them, and he often found it hard to hold his tongue when he heard prominent Jews demand intervention. But it was urgent that America First not be allowed to degenerate into a piece of equipment in the hands of intolerance. Flynn admitted that the charges made against the committee by interventionist groups had some substance. There were anti-Semitic and fascistic elements giving it their support. Flynn himself saw signs of intolerant persons snooping about and perhaps intruding themselves into positions where they may be able to grab this movement, at least its machinery, when its war job is done. Flynn was most concerned with the possible rise of some kind of fascist movement in America when this damnable war hysteria runs out. Such a movement would be a nice, respectable movement dominated by fascist ideas, but never calling itself fascist. Since many of these elements had endorsed the America First Committee, it was conceivable that a new fascist group would be a kind of America First movement, but in a different sense from their own non-interventionist group. America First had to be kept from falling into fascist hands. If war was declared, America First should be dissolved. But if the war ended without U.S. involvement, some of the reactionaries in their group might try to organize themselves under the name America First, in order to use the prestige of this organization. Flynn thought the diverse coalition against intervention that was his America First would splinter and collapse. It would end up split into 3 or 4 or more widely divergent political philosophies. End quote. So here you see that they did sort of have a problem with anti-Semitic elements in America, or pro-fascist elements within America, endorsing America First. And someone called Joseph McWilliams the self-styled American Nazi. And it's interesting because this is talking about a February 20th, 1941 rally with socialist leader Norman Thomas and 2 United States senators, Nye and Wheeler. But many in the audience were prominent pro-fascists, anti-Semitics, chanting about the Jews. And Flynn, who had, obviously come from the New Republic and had come from a liberal position to when he first started America First, he was not a hardcore conservative or reactionary. He was not a pro-fascist. He was not even probably really identified as a nationalist. He was just anti-war. And so he fretted about these people and their presence in the America First movement. Now, it's not particularly surprising that people who were siding with Nazi Germany in the European conflict would look at America First and say, we need to boost these guys because we need to keep America out of the war, because once America joins the war on the side of England, it's going to get a lot harder for Nazi Germany So it's certainly not surprising, and in fact, it's entirely expected that if everyone knows that if America were to get into the war, it would definitely get into the war on the side of England and not on the side of Nazi Germany. It's obvious that the elements within the United States that supported Nazi Germany, of course, they would want to see the America First movement grow stronger because it would help to keep the United States off their backs of Nazi Germany. So that shouldn't come as any surprise, and it also isn't surprising that they were concerned about trying to keep these elements out of America First because they knew that they were providing fodder to the pro-war elements. They were providing fodder to America First's critics. What's interesting here also, though, is that he says Flynn believed that the Jews had given plenty of people good cause to be indignant at them. So Flynn is not like a deeply pro-Jewish individual. He thinks that Jews, he says he found it hard to hold his tongue when he heard prominent Jews demanding intervention. But he thinks ultimately that despite the fact that he's not really, he doesn't want to see America First, or he doesn't want to see the United States go into war, be driven into war by a fairly minuscule fraction of the population in order to, protect their ethnic interests in Europe. And I certainly wouldn't begrudge American Jews for being concerned about the ongoing scenario in Europe and wanting the United States to enter into war. Like, people advocate for their own interests, and they're concerned about the Holocaust. They're concerned about the things that are going on, and they want America to step in. That's entirely understandable. But again, the first question is, what is in the interests of the United States of America? The United States of America is obligated to advance the interests of its people. The state, the United States government, serves the people of the United States. It serves the interests of the residents, the citizens, the people of the United States. It doesn't serve the interests of international Jewry. It doesn't serve the interests of Great Britain. It doesn't serve the interests of France or of anybody else, anywhere, any ethnic group or any nation or any other people anywhere. I'm of English descent, and not coming to the aid of England when England is in a war. There's a part of it that rubs me the wrong way, and I think, well, England is our greatest ally. The United Kingdom is really our greatest ally, more so than anyone else. That's where our culture comes from, and that's who we have the closest ties with. That's the language we speak and our culture, and that's our ethnic origin at the earliest points of the birth of our nation. So it's hard to say, well, we would just allow Great Britain to enter into a war without our help. We would allow Great Britain to lose a war without us stepping in to help them. There's a part of me, as someone who's kind of an Anglophile in a way, that rubs me the wrong way, and I don't like the premise of that. But ultimately, we are not an extension of Great Britain, and if Great Britain foolishly enters into a war that is not to its own advantage, we're not obligated to bail them out. So ultimately, I'm pretty isolationist about it, and I remain of the opinion that the United States ought to only enter into wars that are defensive in nature, and that we certainly ought not be engaging in international shenanigans that leave other nations with little option but to enter into war with us. At any rate, let me continue moving along here, where he says, quote, "The attacks on the committee increased after Colonel Charles A. Lindbergh delivered his famous Des Moines, Iowa speech on September 11th, 1941. While identifying elements responsible for changing our national policy from one of neutrality and independence to one of entanglement and European affairs, Lindbergh stressed that the three most important groups who have been pressing this country toward war are the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration. Interventionist Jews were short-sighted, he asserted, and were a danger to this country because of their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government. Rather than agitate for war, Lindbergh continued, the Jewish groups in this country should be opposing it in every possible way, for they will be among the first to feel its consequences. Tolerance is a virtue that depends upon peace and strength. History shows that it cannot survive war and devastation. As many Jews interpreted his statements, Lindbergh advocated a pogrom for their fellow Jews should war arrive. The America First Committee refused to reprimand Lindbergh publicly and deplored what it termed racist smears against him. Flynn, however, was enraged. Instead of receiving Lindbergh's speech in advance, the usual procedure, Flynn and the New York chapter of America First saw it for the first time in the papers. Lindbergh, Flynn wrote, had never submitted a copy of this speech to anybody at all, and gave out copies to the press only when he had finished delivering it. Not a soul in the organization knew what he was going to say, and of course, no one, so far as I can learn, dreamed of the blast he was about to deliver against the Jews. Flynn vowed to urge Lindbergh to explain publicly that the speech was his own, that he did not consult anybody on the America First Committee, and that the last thing he had in mind was to make an attack on Jews as such. His private reaction, Flynn revealed to Lindbergh, was one of utter distress. The speech had alienated key supporters of the America First Committee, and within the group, those who were in daily eruption against the Jews were uproariously delighted. Those afraid of the issue were equally depressed. Both groups were completely intolerant of each other. The danger was that many individuals would resign. Flynn was sure that Lindbergh was as completely without anti-Semitism as I am, but he warned that the public did not take account of shadings of meaning and that his modifying statements would be ignored. Lindbergh had allowed the organization to be tagged with the anti-Jewish label, and Flynn had been struggling against great odds to keep the committee free of that label. Flynn acknowledged that the Jewish population in New York almost unanimously backed entering the war. He also agreed that war mania did not serve their interests, since America could become quite intolerant when its passions are aroused, and when it is in search of a scapegoat for its misfortunes. Flynn further remarked that some Jewish leaders had sought to brand all those opposed to war as anti-Semitic. It has seemed, he wrote, that their responsibility for this should be brought home to them. But this is a far different matter from going out upon the public platform and denouncing the Jews as the war makers. No man can do that without incurring the guilt of religious and racial intolerance, and that character is poison in a community like ours. Finally, Flynn chastised Lindbergh for delivering a speech of such tremendous repercussive force without taking into your confidence the leaders of the movement who must share with you the responsibility for the consequences. Flynn's dissatisfaction with Lindbergh did not stop him from continuing his own activities with America First. He still saw World War II as a repetition of World War I, a perversion of humanity's quest for peace and justice. Moreover, he thought that the Western powers sought more than the defeat of Axis. Flynn presumed that the old capitalist nations were seeking new forms to structure their collapsing empires. To liberals who asked what was wrong with trying to save Britain, Flynn answered in June 1941 that this meant saving her many colonies, including India, Malay, and countless other subject peoples. End quote. So here you see the great and famous Charles Lindbergh speech in Des Moines, Iowa in 1941, where Lindbergh says that there are three groups pressing our country into war: the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration. But he goes into detail. Now, I haven't read the entirety of Lindbergh's speech, but the parts of it that are referenced here seems like Lindbergh goes into a little bit more detail about the Jewish influence in the country pushing us into war. And Lindbergh, of course, says that the Jews are a danger to the country because of their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government. And so basically he's saying you've got a group that's not very large, even today comprises roughly 2% of the population. I don't know what the percent of the population was back then. I suspect it may have been lower because I think a lot of Jews came to America as a result of World War II. But at any rate, it's not a massive portion of the population that has a lot of influence in certain industries. Lindbergh calls out the media and the government and says that basically, the Jews are going to not have a good go of it if things go poorly and people start blaming the Jews for our presence in the war. Now, things didn't go poorly, for us. We won the war, and blaming the Jews for our presence in World War II never really happened, considering that we won that war. But it's certainly fair to say that, of course, there are certain elements within the country who are going to advocate for our presence in that war. Just like I said, how the people who are sympathetic to the Nazi cause would have been very supportive of America First, even if America First wasn't supportive of them. Similarly, Jews in America, of course, because they know what's going on in Europe, they want America to join the war to help the Jews in Europe. Right? That's not surprising to anybody, and it's not necessarily morally wrong for the Jews to want to save their people overseas. But again, we as a nation are not driven just by the interests of the Jews. We are driven by the interests of our citizens. And so to have a small portion of the country using its influence in media and government and elsewhere to bring us into war, to support their ethnic interests, certainly it's worthwhile to say, well, wait a minute, how does that benefit the rest of us? How does that benefit the country as a whole? It's not just about what benefits you, or even more specifically, it's not just about what benefits your, fellow Jews in foreign lands. The first question that has to be asked, and really the primary question that has to be asked, is how does it benefit us? How does it benefit the citizens of the United States as a whole? So I don't really blame Lindbergh for publicly calling out the Jews in that way, especially when we see that Flynn acknowledged that almost all of the Jews supported entrance into the war, and Lindbergh is identifying who is it that is pushing us into this war. Of course, it's the British. The British want us to enter into that war. But it's interesting that you see such similar themes today about the Jewish influence in media and whether or not that's good for our country to have some small group of people with a tremendous amount of influence in the opinion-making apparatus of the country. To what extent that can be deployed to advance the interests of the Jewish people as a particular ethnic group with an outsized influence. Of course, those mechanisms, those levers of power, those institutional mechanisms to which they have an outsized amount of control will be steered toward their interests. That also shouldn't surprise anybody. Shouldn't surprise anybody, but should be, we should wonder, is that in our best interests? So then there's one last section I'm going to look at here where he says, quote, "Another turn in world affairs affected the fortunes of the non-interventionists. On June 25th, 1941, Hitler's troops invaded Soviet Russia, breaking the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. The Soviets, who had attacked war talk as imperialist maneuvering, now advocated Allied intervention. Since they favored joint action with the West, what they had branded as an imperialist war became a people's anti-fascist struggle. Flynn was not surprised. Hitler wanted the Ukraine and Russia's grainlands and the Baku and Romanian oil fields. The irony of Western action was that the free democratic states were near collapse, while the dark and bloody dictatorship of Stalin had been saved. Flynn was furious that men such as Lindbergh, who had wanted Britain to build a powerful air force, had been condemned, while Western leaders kept on driving one nation after another to fight without weapons, in the wrong places and against the wrong aims, and getting whipped all the way, yet cursing and damning and vilifying those who tell the truth to save them. Stalin had signed a pact with Hitler only to postpone the evil day of war against Russia. Hitler had only wanted to avoid conflict with Stalin while dealing with the West. Now that he had made his moves in Europe, he was free to turn against Russia. Now the interventionists were calling for aid to the Soviet Union. But both Hitler and Stalin, Flynn wrote, were enemies of our form of society. The United States government had put communist leader Earl Browder in jail and was purging communists from jobs and from schools, while they urged us to send millions of young men to Europe to fight the battles of Russian communism. Flynn did not want to spill the blood of one American boy to make the world safe for either Hitler or Stalin. Stalin's Russia was invaded and needed aid. Now Americans were being asked by communists to bleed themselves white with taxation, to disrupt our whole economic system, to plunge ourselves into bankruptcy, and to send millions to fight in a war whose peace terms will have to satisfy communist Russia. The communist reversal had a lot to do with turning Flynn into an anti-communist. Before the United States was even formally at war, he was arguing that fighting on Russia's side would mean that the peace would cater to Stalin's demands. After the Yalta Conference, this argument would become the staple of a new post-war right wing. On September 11th, FDR informed the nation that he had ordered naval and air patrols to clear all German and Italian warships from waters considered vital to America's defense, and had, in effect, ordered American armed forces to shoot on sight. The America First Committee believed that Roosevelt was looking for an incident on the high seas as an excuse for a declaration of war. Although the nation was not at war, Flynn charged that the president was, that he had committed acts of war against Italy and Germany. American ships were convoying British war cargoes for the purpose of pursuing a course designed to force the Axis powers into a corner where they will be compelled to attack us. Roosevelt had promised the American people he would not take them into war, but he meant to provoke an attack, after which he would invoke all the gods of self-defense to take us full blast into the war which he has been clandestinely waging for many months. Roosevelt was attempting to sneak into the war through the back door. Flynn promised to denounce and resist the president's conspiracy until Congress, under the Constitution, declares that we are at war. The America First Committee, he believed, stood alone as a bulwark between this country and war up to the present moment. End quote. So here you see a couple things. One is that Hitler had attacked Russia. Hitler had attacked Russia in violation of the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. And so now, suddenly, all of the communists who had been anti-war, so long as the Nazis and the Soviets were in a non-aggression pact, so the Nazis and the Soviet Union were allies, all of the American communists said, don't enter the war, we don't want to enter the war. Once the Nazis turned on the Soviets, now suddenly we were allies with the Soviet Union. And we had to enter the war to help the Soviet Union. Suddenly we had to fight the Nazis. It went from the wars were imperialist wars that we shouldn't be involved in. So long as the Nazis were allied with the Soviet Union, we need to stay back, stay out of it. Once the Nazis and the Soviets are at war, we have to enter the war to help them. So the communists flipped on a dime in order to support the Soviet Union. And you can see again and again all the different groups in America, including the people on the eastern seaboard tended to be more pro-war. The people in the Midwest tended to be more anti-war. Interestingly, the people on the seaboard tended to be of English descent, and the people in the Midwest were more likely to be of Germanic descent or Scandinavian descent, not English. People from Europe that were not English. But the English people were clustered on the seaboard, and those were the ones who wanted to go to war. It's not surprising, right? Because the United States has all these different ethnic groups. The United States has all these different ideologies, and whether or not we enter the war always seems to be driven by, people's allegiances to some other non-American entity, whether it's allegiance to the Soviet Union, allegiance to the European Jews, allegiance to Germany, allegiance to England. And very few people are thinking about what's in our interests alone and just saying this is the only test to which we need to put this. The only question that we really need to answer is what's in our interests. And that's why they called it the America First Committee, was because the America First Committee said, let's just think about us and not think about what's in the best interests of our fellow communists, what's in the best interests of our fellow Brits, our fellow Anglos, what's in the best interests of our fellow Jews. The America First Committee said, what is in our interests, period. And that, I think, is the correct disposition that we should always take as a nation when we think about what we're doing. And the other thing he talks about is how Roosevelt was sort of trying to provoke a war. He says, FDR informed the nation he had ordered naval and air patrols to clear all German and Italian warships from waters considered vital to America's defense. Well, how far does that spread, And providing security to envoys, providing security to ships that were transporting material to England that could be considered essential for their war effort. The idea being that we were trying to create a situation where the Nazis had no choice but to attack us, to serve their interests, to serve their war interests. The Nazis had to enter into war with us to try to provoke an attack, and then we can say, oh, self-defense demands that we enter into this war. And I think Pearl Harbor has echoes of that. Although, again, like I said, I'm not going to get into the details of Pearl Harbor. I'm not a World War II historian. And one last thing I'll say is that it's interesting that both of the people that I focused on today kind of started on the left and made their way to the right. And that's something that we see so frequently. Even many of the people that are involved with the Trump transition and are going to be involved in the Trump administration, oftentimes people who started on the left and moved to the right. And it just seems like as time passes, as people become wiser about the ways of the world, they always tend to move from left to right. Many of the people who founded National Review move from left to right. That's not to say no one ever moves from right to left, but it's much less common, which just implies, I think, clearly that as one gets older, one grows wiser. One grows more familiar with the way the world works, and accompanying that wisdom always seems to be a shift rightward. So that'll do it for today. Thank you so much for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.